May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be now and always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. What is it they say about the best laid plans of mice and men? This was going to be our most spectacular and dramatic Holy Week ever. We were going to start with a proper Palm Sunday procession following a real live donkey all the way from Ufton Court, waving real live palm branches and singing hosannas to the tune of "What Shall We Do with a Drunken Sailor?" That was Diana's suggestion anyway. Then we'd go on to do something on each of the weekdays, reenact the cleansing of the temple with real live overturning of the money changers' tables and the setting free of the doves. On another day, we were going to go on to reenact the cursing of the fig tree with a real live fig tree, then Judas's appointment with the chief priests to arrange the betrayal of Jesus. Next, we were going to spend a whole morning engaging in a local ritual for Maundy Thursday, representing service and humility, which I'll tell you about in a moment. And finally, there was going to be a dramatic, real live reading of the Passion for Good Friday. We were going to involve everyone in doing this. It was going to be immensely practical and visual. We were even going to have some minimal attempt at authentic costumes. If all of this seems an awful lot of church to you, let me reassure you that this wasn't for this congregation. It was for our other congregation, the one that meets in the school week in, week out, every morning at 9 o'clock, and is mostly under 12. They're as much members of the Christian community in our villages as those who are more of the Sunday persuasion. So the Maundy Thursday observance of the course was going to be the Ufton Dole, naturally. And the whole thing was going to happen a week early on each of the 5 days before the end of term. It would all have been as visual and dramatic as we could make it. When you tell the story, a picture is worth 1,000 sermons. So conjure it up for yourselves. Imagine following a donkey from Ufton Court to the school, or from the city wall of Jerusalem to the Temple Mount, whichever you prefer. The crowd waving and all singing their hosannas, a word that means save us now. The laying of cloaks on the road, the waving of palm branches which make a wonderful swishing noise, a sight to remember then, and certainly worth recalling 2,000 years later. As it was indeed in 1917, when General Allenby entered Jerusalem to take the city and dismounted from his white horse as he passed through the Jaffa Gate, because he knew from his Bible that only the Messiah will enter the city on a white horse. As then, so 2,000 years before, there could be no doubt that anyone continuing through the Jaffa Gate would be seen as a king coming to claim his own. But what happened next with Jesus was strange. Listen to it. He left them, went out of the city to Bethany, and he spent the night there. What an anticlimax at the end of the day, such a carefully planned and choreographed piece of political theatre in the morning, then back home to his friend's cottage for a mug of Ovaltine before an early night. After such a triumphant morning, why didn't he go on to take the whole city by storm? Well, let's go back to the beginning of Lent. We heard Jesus in the wilderness being tempted by the devil. The devil he tried to persuade him to do spectacular things like throwing himself off the temple roof to create a show. And Jesus refuses this easy way, because that was not the way it was going to happen. And it's the same here. The crowd who had acclaimed him king in the morning would have proved fickle when the Romans intervened. The process that would eventually end up with a Christian emperor on the throne in Rome, well, that would take centuries, not days. Christ had to do things slowly according to the rules, the rules laid out for all to read in Scripture. At this time of year, we actually need to make more of this business of prophecy in Scripture, because of all things, this was what Jesus wanted to stress. After his resurrection, he met 2 disciples on the Emmaus Road. Did they spend their time reminiscing about old days or making plans for the future? No. Beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus expounded all that was written about him in the Scripture. They spent the evening in Bible study. Blessed are they who've not seen and yet have been believed, he said to the disciples. And what he meant was that those 12 blithering idiots had missed the whole point. Because in everything he was doing, Christ was following an agenda. It wasn't that he wanted the penny to drop. He wasn't hoping they'd say, well, ain't that just the dangdest thing? He'd been faithfully following the script that had been written for him by the prophets over 700 years. It's not chance, it's not a wonderful, miraculous coincidence that these things happened and people were able to say, gosh, that's what Isaiah was talking about. No, Jesus had worked out what was going to be required of him, what he'd have to do, what would happen to him as a result. We saw the suffering servant in Isaiah in the first reading. Jesus would have to undertake to suffer. But he knew from the prophecy of Isaiah that he would be vindicated. From the story of Ezekiel and the dry bones we had a little while back, he'd heard about life returning after death and defeat. In the prophet Hosea, he'll have read, after 2 days he'll revive us, on the 3rd day he will raise us up, that we may live in his sight. And the prophet Zechariah had written this, rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. That had to be done. Anyone coming any other way was not making the prophecy come true. It was an impostor, wouldn't succeed. And then take this from the prophet Malachi. On the day of the Lord, he will come into Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. He will purify the temple. He will declare judgment for the widow. That's there in the Old Testament. That was Jesus' agenda. And what does he do? He comes into Jerusalem triumphantly on a donkey, as Zechariah had said, from the Mount of Olives. He overturns the tables of the money changers in the temple, which they'd been turning into a den of thieves. There's the purification of the temple for you. Then he sees a widow putting her mite into the offering boxes when the temple should have been looking after her. He praises her. He declares judgment for her. He has fulfilled Malachi's prophecy. And in everything that followed up to Good Friday, Easter and beyond, he was following the agenda set for him by Scripture. Following the agenda set by Scripture, that's a very modern way of putting it, of course. Jesus would have said something different. He would have called it obedience. He'd have said he was doing the will of his Father, as revealed by the prophets. The 30 years of Jesus' life leading up to this final week, these times had been a time of obedient preparation for this week in Jerusalem, faithfully and punctiliously doing what his Father required. Everything would hinge on these last few days. Not upon his teaching and preaching in Galilee, that was all behind him, not the miracles he'd worked or the parables he'd told, but what would happen, what would be done to him, what would be achieved during this Holy Week. For us, this is where this sermon needs to begin. Jesus had lived 30 years, an active and productive young life that we can follow in the Gospels, admirable in every way. And yet here he was, just 5 days before his death, having to achieve in such a short time the whole purpose of his life. How would that apply to you? Every one of you listening has lived a good, active, full and purposeful life. But what if you were told that everything so far has been just a preparation for the next bit of your life? That the next year, the next month, week or day, the time has come for all that early promise you showed to be fulfilled? How would you respond? Do you feel actually that you've run your course, you've done your bit, it's time for a bit of slumber? Or would you jump at a chance of something new? I'm not talking about taking on some new kind of activity. I don't mean a simple rearrangement. What I do mean is a refocusing. Something as simple as standing up and turning to the sun. This sermon hasn't finished. It needs to continue with what this does actually mean for us. I shall be giving an address each day this week, but they won't be here on YouTube. There'll be podcasts. I've never done a podcast before, and I hope it works. I'll send you links, and just as soon as I've worked out how, go to Anchor, anchor.fm, anchor.fm, and look for John-Peyton. Keep well, stay safe, and may God be with you.